Imagine walking through a world where the Roman legions still patrol the roads, where Latin is spoken from Britain to Egypt, and where the Colosseum still hosts grand spectacles under the gaze of emperors. Picture a world where Rome never collapsed, where its empire continued unbroken into the Middle Ages and beyond, shaping the destiny of humanity. History tells us that in 476 AD, the Western Roman Empire fell. Its emperors lost power. Its cities declined and its once united territories fragmented into kingdoms. The collapse ushered in centuries of turmoil, leaving us with the fractured map of Europe we know today. But what if that moment never happened? What if Rome endured? This is not just a fantasy. It is a lens through which we can imagine how differently our languages, religions, governments, and technologies might have evolved if the world's greatest empire had survived. Rome at its height. At its peak in the 2nd century AD, Rome was unmatched. Its roads stretched across continents, aqueducts carried water into gleaming cities, and its armies enforced order on an empire of nearly 50 million people. A common legal code governed diverse peoples, from Celts in Britain to Egyptians on the Nile. Latin tied the West together, while Greek bound the East. The empire was not perfect. Corruption thrived, inequality was stark, and unrest brewed constantly. Yet it offered something rare in history: stability. It was a superpower that lasted for centuries, and in many ways, it created the very foundations of the modern world. So why did it fall, and what would it have meant if it had not? Why Rome fell. By the 3rd and 4th centuries, cracks in the empire widened into fractures. The economy faltered under heavy taxes, inflation, and a reliance on slave labor that stifled innovation. The army was stretched thin, forced to defend massive frontiers against Persians, Germans, and nomads from the steppes. Political chaos made matters worse as generals overthrew emperors, civil wars drained resources, and no stable system of succession emerged. The empire divided into East and West. The wealthier Eastern Empire, later known as Byzantium, survived for another 1,000 years. But the Western Empire collapsed under the weight of invasions. Visigoths, Vandals, Huns, and finally Germanic tribes swept across its borders. In 476 AD, the Western Roman Emperor Romulus Augustulus was deposed, and the empire was no more. This collapse was not inevitable. Small changes, stronger leadership, better reforms, smarter diplomacy might have altered the course of history. And if Rome had endured, the consequences would have been extraordinary. If Rome survived, imagine that reforms took root. Suppose Rome found a way to control inflation, distribute land more fairly, and encourage technological progress instead of relying on endless slave labor. Imagine that emperors secured loyalty not through bribes, but through a stable system of succession, avoiding constant assassinations and civil wars. Imagine, too, that Rome learned to integrate Germanic tribes into its empire, rather than treating them as enemies at the gates. In this alternate timeline, the Western Empire does not collapse. Instead, it adapts, absorbs its rivals, and enters the Middle Ages as a unified and powerful state. The consequences ripple outward immediately. Europe does not fragment into dozens of kingdoms. The infrastructure of Roman roads, aqueducts, and cities continues to thrive, unbroken by centuries of decay. Trade flows more smoothly, knowledge spreads more freely, and the stability of empire prevents the isolation and stagnation that marked the so-called Dark Ages. If Rome had survived, the languages of Europe would look very different today. Instead of splitting into French, Spanish, Italian, and Portuguese, Latin might have remained the dominant tongue of the West. The Germanic influence that shaped English may never have taken hold in the same way. It is possible that most of Europe today would still speak a single, unified language, descended directly from Latin. Religion, too, would have taken a different course. Christianity was already spreading rapidly in the empire before its fall. A strong, enduring Rome might have centralized the faith even further, preventing the divisions that later created separate Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestant traditions. Alternatively, if pagan traditions had persisted alongside Christianity under imperial tolerance, Europe might have developed a unique blend of religions, combining Roman gods with Christian teachings in ways we can only imagine. Technology is another great question. Rome was brilliant at engineering, but often slow to innovate, relying heavily on manpower and slaves. If the empire had reformed its economy and embraced new technologies, the progress of science might have accelerated by centuries. Some historians speculate that industrial revolutions could have arrived long before the 18th century. Imagine steam power or advanced medicine emerging in antiquity, fueled by a stable empire that encouraged discovery. The wider world. The survival of Rome would not only have reshaped Europe, the empire's influence stretched deep into North Africa and the Middle East. With continued stability, trade routes might have expanded further into sub-Saharan Africa and across Asia. The Silk Road could have become even more robust under Roman protection, connecting East and West in ways far stronger than in our timeline. This could have altered encounters with civilizations like China and India. Instead of fragmented kingdoms in medieval Europe, cautiously trading through middlemen, a united Rome might have engaged in direct and large-scale exchanges with Asia centuries earlier. Even the Americas might have been reached sooner. Rome was a seafaring power. With time, improved navigation could have led Roman ships westward long before Columbus. What they might have found and how those encounters would have changed history remains one of the most tantalizing what-ifs of all. Yet, a surviving Rome would not necessarily have been a utopia. The empire was built on conquest, hierarchy, and control. A stronger, lasting Rome might have meant even longer periods of oppression for subject peoples. Slavery might have continued unchecked, delaying social progress. The diversity of nations and cultures that emerged after Rome's fall might never have had the chance to develop their own identities. In our world, the collapse of Rome allowed new kingdoms to rise, gave birth to new languages, and eventually fostered new systems of government. Without the fall, feudalism may never have emerged. The Renaissance might have looked entirely different, and the modern nation-state might never have been born. History is not simply about power enduring. It is also about the opportunities that come after collapse. Still, the idea of a Rome that never fell captures our imagination because it forces us to see how much of our world is shaped by accident and fragility. If Rome had endured, we might live in a far more unified world today, bound by a single empire's legacy of law, language, and order. Our technologies might be centuries ahead, our religions less divided, and our politics more centralized. Or we might live in a world dominated by authoritarian power, where one empire suppressed the diversity and creativity that came from fragmentation. Rome's survival could have brought stability, but at the cost of freedom. The truth is, we cannot know. But imagining it helps us understand the weight of history and how even the mightiest empires are vulnerable to collapse. The Roman Empire's fall was one of the most significant turning points in history. It ended an age of unity and stability and plunged Europe into centuries of change, struggle, and reinvention. But had it endured, our world would look utterly different, perhaps more advanced, perhaps more unified, but also perhaps more constrained. The ruins of Rome remind us that no power lasts forever. Yet they also remind us that collapse is not the end, but a transformation. Rome did not vanish completely. Its laws, languages, and culture still shape us today. The empire may have fallen, but in many ways, Rome never truly died. And perhaps that is the final answer to the question. What if the Roman Empire never fell? In some sense, it didn't. It lives on in every word of Latin descent, in every legal system built on Roman law, in every road and aqueduct that still stands after 2 millennia. Rome endures, not as a political empire, but as a civilization that shaped the world.